So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of the P&W series on race, racism, and anti-racism, featuring my esteemed colleagues, Professors Meiko Yamada and Professor Deepa Majumdar. I'm Karen Bishop-Morris. I'm an associate professor of English at Purdue University Northwest, where I teach courses in writing and African-American literature. I'm also director of the Northwest Indiana Writing Project, and I will serve as your moderator today. Today is an auspicious day. It's the beginning of spring, much needed, right? It's also a day when we, reflect on the world really coming together as Ukrainians fight so valiantly for their freedom. So that's what's happening globally and nationally. The House, we know, has passed the bill named for Emmett Till, which has made lynching a federal hate crime. And then closer to home, we know that the Indiana Senate killed the controversial House Bill 1134, which was critical race theory, so-called inspired legislation. But that legislation would have limited what teachers can say in the classroom with respect to race and sex and religion, among other things. And so its defeat is definitely a victory for us in the work we're doing today with anti-racism. Our loyal followers know that this series began very grassroots, fall of 2020. It's faculty driven, and it was in response to the horrific murder of George Floyd. We thought it was our duty to create space for dialogue around racialized police violence and the systemic racism that continues to characterize institutions and thwart the advancement of BIPOC individuals across society. We're dedicating this series to Glenn Ford, who was the founder and executive editor of the Black Agenda Report. Mr. Ford was our first guest in the series, courtesy of and in dialogue with Professor Lee Arts. Mr. Ford made his transition in the fall of 2021, and we are just forever grateful for his intellectual energy and the gift of his presence in kicking off this series. We hope that you leave today's session more knowledgeable than before. We hope that you remain open-minded, honest, and active. And most of all, that you will apply what you take away today to make some connection or to recommit to doing the work. Some thank yous, some announcements, and then on to our speakers. So first of all, thank you, Professor Majumdar, my partner in peaceful protest, for the vision and the energy to sustain this series. Thank you to our sponsors, Chancellor Keon, Provost Holford, and our other P&W backbones. So none of this would happen without the tireless efforts of Sue Brimmer, Chris Falzone and her team, Michelle Gahuli, Rachel Pollack, Jamie Eggert, and then today we have with us our student media assistant, Sharansai Madanini, and from the AV team, he must have pulled the short straw, but we've got Josiah Tipton, and we're just so grateful for all of the magic Josiah works behind the scenes with last week's events for Tim Wise, and then certainly today. Thank you, Josiah, and thanks to all of you. Couple of announcements. Views and opinions expressed during this series do not necessarily reflect the opinion of Purdue University Northwest faculty, students, or staff. Last announcement, we're just encouraging you to post your questions and comments to the chat at any time during the session. We will reserve about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, but it's super helpful if you post along the way so we have an opportunity to synthesize your questions and get as many in as possible. So we want maximum participation. And with that, I'm going to move into these introductions, and after that, the next voice you'll hear will be that of Dr. Meiko Yamada. Dr. Meiko Yamada is professor of sociology at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. Her areas of expertise in sociology are race, ethnicity, the sociology of education, and applied sociology. She has taught the race and ethnic relations course at Purdue Fort Wayne for 15 years. Dr. Yamada's current research focuses on community engagement, working with local social service agencies. Her book, there on the screen, is The Role of English Teaching in Modern Japan, Diversity and Multiculturalism Through English Language Education in a Globalized Era. Dr. Yamada has two forthcoming works in prestigious journals: The Role of Homeless Shelter Workers, a study of staff serving homeless veterans, coming out any day now in the Journal of Applied Social Science. And then also forthcoming a chapter in EFL Education. Well, actually the title of her chapter is EFL Education for Social Justice, a study of Japanese EFL student teachers' perceptions about diversity and minority. And that's in the forthcoming collection titled Theoretical and Applied Perspectives on Teaching Foreign Languages in Multilingual Settings. So welcome, Dr. Yamada. And then someone who probably needs very little introduction. Dr. Deepa Majumdar is a professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. Her area of specialization is at the cusp of philosophy and theology. Besides her well-received book on Ploutness's Cosmology, which was republished by Routledge in 2016, she is also the author of a volume of philosophical poetry. Dr. Majumdar has published several papers, mainly in peer-reviewed international journals. And while her work focuses on the philosophy of Ploutness and on comparative theology, she has also published papers on Plato and Gandhi. In addition, she has published book chapters in anthologies and book reviews in top-tier international philosophy journals. Finally, of late, she has published essays on topics as diverse as technology and the pandemic. In her spare time, Dr. Majumdar loves to write and listen to traditional Indian music. Please join me in welcoming Professors Meiko, Yamada, and Deepa Majumdar.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, and also Deepa, for giving me this opportunity and also introduction of myself. Okay. Well, my talk today focuses on color-blindness. Contemporary racism is often viewed and categorized as a color-blind racism, which is quite different from the past racism, such as Jim Crow racism. Well, first of all, I'd like you to think about everyday life conversation with your family, friends, classmates, co-workers, etc. These are just simple questions. What comes to your mind when you hear the term race? How often do you talk about race in any situation? How do you feel when you mention or talk about race? And how comfortable are you when you actually say black, brown, white, etc.? So let's take a moment to think about these questions. Usually, I teach race and ethnicity in a sociology curriculum here at PFW. And in my class, I do, give an exercise, but, given this situation, it's almost impossible. So I decide to just give you those simple questions. Is talking about race positive or negative? Any thoughts associated with race? Well, when it comes to race and racism, well, when we say racism is a really negative term, so we tend to think about negative connotation idea. Depending on individual responses will vary. Some say they often talk about race, but others may say, no, not at all. And in sociology, we have examined contemporary attitudes toward race and racism, and very often found that the people tend not to talk about race. So the question here is, why not talking about race? So there might be a good reason, so several reasons for it. Maybe not necessary, but to me, this is really problematic because, we recognize there is a racism, but, if people think it's not necessary to talk about, that's a problem. Anyway, so this might be a reason. So talking about race could be negative, considered taboo. And maybe talking about race is uncomfortable. So as a result, people tend to avoid talking about race and racism. What about these? Have you heard the following sentences or comments? I see one race, human race. This sounds really beautiful. However, it doesn't really recognize differences. What about these? I don't see color. I don't see race. You may have heard somebody saying this, but again, those two comments also deny or pretend not to see color or race. In other situation, you may have heard somebody saying like, I'm not racist, but XYZ, or I don't have any bias, but somebody said blah, 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 kind of thing. So those two last two phrases really sounds defensive, avoiding, talking about race, even though they may recognize racism or race, but they avoid, defensive about that. So color-blindness is a type of racism, contemporary racism, and that implied being passive about race and racism. So contemporary racism is becoming really subtle. Actually, original idea came from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. You may have heard this. One's skin color doesn't matter, but the content of themselves does. Original goal was to pursue a just society where one's skin color shouldn't be used to judge people. Of course, in a contemporary society, people, practice color-blindness just given this interpretation. Because of this, however, we have seen many, efforts, which is nice by creating laws and regulation in order to reduce prejudice and discrimination against particular people or cultural groups. So we all know racism is wrong. Even it is illegal for people to commit, when they commit, discrimination, prejudice. So because of that kind of attitude, people become hesitant to talk about race and racism. So, given that situation, contemporary attitude is really subtle, institutional, and even non-racial, meaning race neutral. Well, according to Bonilla Silva, who is a sociologist and specializes race relations in the United States, colorblind racism is a racism without racists. What does it mean? I think you can tell this in contemporary society. Like I said, we all know racism is wrong. So people become hesitant to talk about race and racism, even defend themselves. Nobody wants to be called racist. They don't want to be, considered racist. As a result, they avoid talking about race and racism, even though they know racism still exists. And such passive attitude actually will lead to more complicated issue. So microaggression, you may have heard this. Microaggressions are, one type of issue, of course, in a contemporary society. It's really tricky, of course. Some example, you may think about this. Some examples are avoidance of touching or making eye contact with somebody of color, crossing the street when approaching a person of color, not responding to expressions of greetings, ignoring a person of color in a conversations. Of course, if it's obvious, insulting comments or attitude, you can tell. However, it's really indirect, hidden messages. So even victim of microaggressions, do not necessarily recognize, what they receive. Well, I am Japanese. Actually, I was born in Japan. Now I'm living in the United States and working here. And to be honest, sometimes I experience microaggressions in actually some places. And I live here, well, since 2001. I live here more than 20 years. And sometimes people ask me, well, actually said to me, you speak English very well. And then I'm being kind of ironic to say, well, thank you so much. I have PhD. Right? But I live here for 20 years. But I often get that kind of question. And sometimes when we introduce ourselves, they ask me, so where are you from? Well, I was international students here, so it was really a natural question I received. I was thinking, but after 20 years passed, people still ask me where I'm from, right? So sometimes I say I'm from Michigan because before I came to India, and I lived in Michigan, so I often say that I'm from Michigan. Anyway, so that kind of thing. So just think about this, what kind of question people ask you or you ask. And I try not to recognize this, but if I were white man, people would ask same question, kind of thing. So just I like you to start to think about that. So what are consequences of color blindness? Yes, color blindness recognizes race itself, but ignores racial hierarchy or inequality. It makes white privilege invisible because it's becoming norm, institutionalized. As a result, it allows whites to keep their privilege and norms. So to sum up, of course, my point is avoidance is not a solution. Avoidance of talking about race and racism is not solution. It just causes neglecting racial inequality and hierarchy. As a result, help maintain racial hierarchy and power unequal arrangement. So what can we do with the colorblind racism or colorblindness, colorblind attitude to work on toward a just society? So I want to encourage all of us to be open and honest about racial differences and similarities. Of course, nobody's perfect. If we have a question, we can ask. We should ask, right? And I don't know everything, of course. So if we make a mistake, of course, we can learn from the mistake. So even though what can we do is a little, I think we can make a great step to move forward. First of all, I actually want us to create a safe space to talk about race and also racism and learn from each other and embrace positive racial identity. I think I did in the racial attitude also influence or reflect one's identity. So it's really critical. And especially in, I teach race and ethnicity. So one of my job is to create a safe space where students and also myself talk about race and racism. And I know nowadays, of course, all institutions, including university colleges and workplaces, they must have diversity workshop and training. So in a talk series like this is really an excellent way, for us to participate and talk about race. So, attend that, any situation. And then, I really believe that keeping dialogue is, good way for us to understand each other. And there's no way shortcut to resolve racism. It's really serious. Serious issue. So I want us to really think about that issue. You know, this is really everyday life issue to anybody. So, well, thank you so much for your attention. And I believe this, my talk will also lead to, Deepa's talk next. So thank you very much.
While Professor Majumdar is getting ready, I'd just like to encourage folks to, again, post your questions in the chat at any time.
Can everyone hear me? Is my voice loud enough? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Meiko. And I'd like to say a few words before I start my presentation. First, I will be approaching this problem from a somewhat different, it might seem like an opposite point of view, but actually I'm really going to be building on what Professor Yamada just said. But I go beyond colorblindness to what I would call body blindness, okay? So, I'll be first presenting my views before invoking Plato and then wrapping it up. But before I do anything else, I'd like to present my portion of today's presentation to my colleague, a faculty member who taught at the Westfield campus for many, many years, and he retired many years ago. And on January 9th, I think it was, January 9th this year, he passed away. And this is Dr. Frederick C. Patton that I'm speaking of. Had he been still living, and had he known about this, series, I think he'd have been very happy, because he taught classes on race and anti-racism and racism for several years at PNC, the former PNC, and taught it through sociology. So I'd like to dedicate my portion today to him and to his memory, in addition to the series being dedicated to Mr. Ford. So let me begin then with I'm going to share screen of my presentation. And so this is, it's called Racism and the whole idea of beauty, because beauty is a very mercurial kind of quality that can be electric in certain circumstances and really lethal in others. And so what is it that we mean by beauty? Because racism has an unmistakable aesthetic aspect to it. So there's no use dismissing that or trivializing it, saying that it's not as important as the class aspect of racism or the gender aspect of racism. I think it all ties in together. These are hugely interconnected, and it doesn't help to ignore others. The more holistic we can be, the better, I would think. So I'm going to start. With this slideshow. So Racism and Beauty is the title. And I'm going to begin with two quotations that imply what I would call the aesthetically chaste eye, okay, which is the eye that is genuinely no longer prejudiced, okay? And so I'm going to begin with two quotes. The first is from His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. He often says we are the same human beings. So what does he mean by that? Okay, that's going well beyond colorblindness or that kind of colorblindness or glossing over race issues. The same Dalai Lama is also very cognizant of all the evils in the world, of which racism is one. I'm also going to cite this quote from Dr. King. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So I'm going to come back to Dalai Lama and King through the course of this presentation. Let me then move on to the contents of my presentation, and I hope the print is large enough. If not, please signal and let me know, and I will do my best to increase the size. So racism has many aspects, one of which is aesthetic, because race is physical. Racism has a physical dimension, and with it an aesthetic aspect. Our thirst for power becomes aesthetics when beauty aligns itself with power, severing itself from goodness. Let me clarify here that by power, I mean something negative. I do not mean strength. People often confuse power with strength, but really, if I think of what is the opposite of God, I don't think of the devil. I don't think of typical philosophical, contraries to God, like nothingness or matter. I think of power. I think when a person, right now, what's happening in Ukraine is a huge lust for power on the part of Mr. Putin. And so it is, power is something really lethal, and power and goodness are in opposite directions in a Platonic sense. And so I think beauty becomes a problem when it aligns itself with power, severing itself from goodness. So power and goodness move in opposite directions. Racism comes with highly subjective aesthetic judgments. It also comes with racist notions of physical beauty and ugliness. It is physical. So this means that at the lower level, both beauty and ugliness lie in the eye of the beholder. That is, both are subjective and fictional. And there is good subjectivity, and this can be at best benign, but I wouldn't call it good subjectivity. Both beauty and ugliness also lie sometimes in the eyes of multiple unanimous beholders who have not necessarily consulted one another. This is because the human eye can be mob-like, and please note that unanimity need not mean objectivity. Right now, we're seeing a good unanimity against Russia in the Ukraine crisis, but unanimity is not always good. So, a mob, for example, a racist mob about to lynch someone is unanimous, but that doesn't mean that they're objective, right? So just because multiple unanimous beholders agree on a particular aesthetics need not mean that that aesthetics is objectively true. Racism uses multiple phenotypes. These are observable traits. And one of these is color, which leads to the prejudice of colorism. Other phenotypes like shape of eyes or nose, height, hair type, etc. Typically, racism extends beyond colorism to include prejudice also against these other phenotypes. So here's a historical example of racist aesthetics. Colonialism left the colonized feeling inferior before white people, meaning of European descent, not only morally and mentally or intellectually, but also aesthetically. Caucasian phenotypes, especially color, were deemed aesthetically superior to those of Black or brown people. Beyond color, other phenotypes like blonde hair and blue eyes became iconic in colonial consciousness as symbols of true beauty, in quotes, defining their opposites as ugly, which means that the colonized therefore saw themselves as ugly. I'd also like to quickly add here a caveat that white on Black racism is only one type. Racism, especially colorism, exists in multiple forms worldwide: brown on Black, Black on brown, even brown on white, plus between different shades in each color category. Each type comes with its own subjective aesthetics, usually favoring lighter skin tones. Reverse racism often comes with hatred, which is why it's problematic, but I don't know that it necessarily comes with a reverse racist aesthetics unless it's entirely reactive. That's a different kind of category right there. So here are my preliminary conclusions. Racist aesthetics lies in the eyes of the beholder, is highly subjective, hence severed from ethics, can be evil when it causes prejudice, hatred, and violence. And second, phenotypes on their own are amoral facts, but racism politicizes them. So this then leads to the whole question of what is beauty. And here I will express my views before coming to Plato. And here I'm invoking both Western thought as well as Eastern. And this first point is Eastern, when I say that beauty and ugliness are one among what are known as the pairs of opposites, like yin and yang, like light and dark, good and evil, etc. So beauty and ugliness really, in their subjective forms, really define and limit one another. Beauty comes at different levels. Lower beauty, and hence lower ugliness, is lower meaning not as true or more subjective, is material, sensual, external, subjective, and severed from ethics. It's a problem when aesthetics get severed from ethics. The higher the beauty and the higher the ugliness, even ugliness can be more objective, the more inward, abstract, objective, and ethical it becomes. So for example, a murder scene is ugly in a very objective kind of sense. That's a more objective use of the word ugly than to say a particular race is ugly. Higher beauty applies to the moral virtues like kindness, honesty, etc., and higher ugliness applies to the vices. In some religions, the highest beauty applies to God. So for example, for Tagore, who's an great Indian poet, God is called the beautiful. So continuing on what is beauty, beauty comes therefore in two broad categories, each with subcategories. There are three levels of material beauty: that which lies in the eyes of the individual beholder, entirely subjective and perishable; that which lies in the eyes of multiple unanimous beholders, entirely subjective and perishable, again, despite unanimity. So let me give you an example of unanimous aesthetic acclaim that need not be objective. The acclaim of symmetry and proportionality. These are universally acclaimed as being beautiful, but how do we know that they're truly beautiful? Because they're entirely outward in a sense. And then there's a third level of material beauty, which is really the highest, that which serves as a conduit of what Plato would call transcendental divine beauty. This beauty reaches beyond mere unanimity to being truly objective and real, in Platonic terms real, Vedantic terms real as well. So I think we see a lot of this in nature, the beauty of a sunrise, a sunset, or the starry skies. So if physical beauty matters at all, this is only because at its highest, it points the way to divine beauty. But then higher than material beauty are moral and supramoral beauty, beauty of the moral virtues, beauty of contemplation and character, beauty of God, sometimes defined as the beautiful. So why does beauty matter? In general, beauty matters because it satisfies our eyes, slaking their thirst for beauty. Our eyes rest when they come upon beauty. They get agitated when they encounter the ugly. They therefore shun the ugly. I agree with Plato wholeheartedly here. Modern man, I think, has a tyrannical aesthetics. He constantly seeks beauty, contorting nature to fit into his model of aesthetics. He almost cannot deal with the ugly. I mean, modern prosperous man. So if we do why beauty matters now by level, lower material beauty matters at its highest level. I've already said this, when it is a conduit of the divine, because it's a hint at higher celestial beauty, like the beauty of nature. As we purify our eyes, we begin to find higher material beauty, no longer caged in prejudices, in unexpected places. Let me give a brief example here. I was once watching a documentary on the life of Mother Teresa, a life and work of Mother Teresa with a friend. And there was one scene where Mother Teresa is bending low over the starving man with, gaunt face, really, and eyes that were like popping out of his really gaunt kind of face. And my friend pointed to the beauty, not so much in Mother Teresa as much as in this man's eyes. So I think when we purify our eyes, we begin to find higher, it's material beauty still, but it's a much more sophisticated and refined kind of beauty in places that, the fashion industry would not find it. But higher non-material beauty matters much more than lower material beauty, because it is inherently ethical and objective. It satiates and uplifts the human spirit. So anti-racist aesthetics, one way to find racist aesthetics is through worldly success. As people of color climb the socioeconomic ladder, the racist subjective aesthetic outlook changes. He begins to find them beautiful, but through a lingering search for power. For example, the worldly success of Asian Americans have altered American aesthetics towards Asian phenotypes. I'm hugely critical of this approach to resolving the problem of beauty, because this approach to anti-racist aesthetics fails, I think, because it remains worldly, perishable, power-hungry and power-driven and racist. At best, it rearranges ranks on the totem pole of racism. It does not remove this pole. It's also hugely class prejudiced. The same may be said of even anti-racist rejoinders, like Black is beautiful or brown is beautiful, because they do not transcend race, color, race consciousness, or the totem pole of racism. A better solution, ethically better, more durable way to fight racist aesthetics is to transcend race and body consciousness, ascending from the unchaste to the chaste eye that sees beyond body and materialism. So the chaste eye is aesthetically indifferent to racial and physical differences. Reaching beyond colorblindness, it is body blind, meaning this purified eye no longer discriminates based on prejudice against physical phenotypes. But aesthetic indifference, let me just emphasize this. This is where I'm agreeing with Professor Yamada. Aesthetic indifference is not an absolute or a virtue or universal in its applications. It should not apply to situations where race and color are used to discriminate against the oppressed. In these contexts, color differences matter and should be recognized. By contrast, aesthetic indifference should apply to racists with aesthetic prejudice. It should also apply to humanitarians who seek to transcend the body to find our common humanity in all persons. It was this kind of aesthetic indifference applied to the prejudice, the prejudiced person that I think Dr. King sought when he asked for judgment based on character rather than color. Aesthetic indifference means judging people by who they are or their inner beauty or lack thereof, not how they look. So what does Plato say on beauty, and how would he hypothetically react to contemporary racism? So Plato divides beauty into two categories. At the highest level is what he calls beauty in itself. This is the pure transcendental quality of true objective beauty. It is one of the Platonic forms, which means it's a pure exemplar, like justice in itself, the pure distilled quality of beauty. Let me give you an ordinary, very homey example. Imagine that you're baking a cake and you're baking cookies, and you're using the same essence for both, which is a vanilla essence, okay? Think of that vanilla essence as beauty in itself. And the cake and the cookies will now pick up the flavor of the vanilla. Likewise, things that are truly beautiful in the empirical world, really beautiful, have a flavor of beauty in itself in them. Beauty in itself for Plato does not lie in the eye of the beholder. He says beauty in itself he defines beauty in itself as that which is harmonious with all that is divine, with ugliness being inharmonious with all that is divine. This makes beauty in itself absolute, objective, eternal, or immortal. The same with ugliness, absolute, objective, eternal, or immortal. Although harmonious with the divine, however, beauty in itself for Plato is below the good, which is Plato's God. At the lower level, Plato has what he calls perishing beauties. These are below beauty in itself. They're subjective, they're mortal. They lie in the eye of the beholder, and they should be one of Plato's perishing beauties, as I've already stated, because beauty in the eye of the beholder is subjective. For Plato, beauty in itself imparts itself to mortal perishing beauty. So he connects the highest and the lowest levels of beauty. Beauty in itself, therefore, redeems these perishing beauties by lending them immortality. Perishing beauties do not have to earn or merit beauty in itself. When material objects serve as conduits of divine beauty, that is the third highest type of material beauty I spoke of earlier, they express beauty in itself. For example, a sunset, a beautiful sunset is a conduit of beauty in itself. It expresses beauty in itself, but it does not have to merit beauty in itself. For Plato, love always pursues beauty. The higher the beauty, the higher the love. There is therefore a ladder of love and beauty. At the lowest level, love pursues the carnal, earthly, perishing beauties. As love evolves morally, it pursues more inward and abstract forms of beauty. And so Plato summarizes his ladder of love and beauty as follows. He says, beginning from beauties of earth, the lover mounts upward for the sake of that other beauty, meaning beauty in itself is a magnet that attracts and enables this ascent. From one fair or beautiful form, the lover goes on to two by noticing that beauty is a quality shared by all beautiful physical forms, meaning they all express the same beauty in itself. This begins the inwardness of beauty. The lover then goes from two to all fair forms, but please note this is not promiscuity, because the lover is loving a quality in all physical forms, namely beauty in itself, which lends them true beauty. From fair forms, the lover rises to fair practices. This is more inward. From fair practices, the lover rises to fair notions. This is beautiful institutions, laws, and sciences. For example, the ideal of anti-racism is a fair notion. Finally, from fair or beautiful notions, the lover arrives at the highest, most wondrous vision of the pure quality of beauty, which is absolute beauty, which is beauty in itself. At last, he knows what the essence of beauty is, and this is at the most inward level. So how would Plato respond to contemporary racism? By rejecting all types of beauty in the eyes of the beholder, including racist definitions of beauty, because these are subjective, perishing beauties. By rejecting the racist definition of ugliness, because this too is in the eye of the beholder and hence subjective and fictitious. By rejecting racism, because it is objectively ugly, inharmonious with the divine, because it is, I've always said racism is a sin, is always a sin and sometimes a crime. Plato would also urge us to use his ladder of love to reach the aesthetically indifferent chaste eye, and would urge us to appreciate more inward abstract forms of universal beauty as we ascend his ladder to reach growing body blindness. Plato, the arch-idealist, would define the chaste eye as one that can detect the sublime presence of beauty in itself in all perishing beauties. This eye is therefore aesthetically indifferent to perishing beauties. Plato would draw aesthetic indifference or body blindness from the highest vision of beauty in itself in all material things. Hopefully, Plato would allow recognition of racial differences when necessary to remove racial injustice. Plato would declare this final vision of beauty in itself in earthly beauties as the ultimate solution to appearance-based racist aesthetics. For lower solutions, he would advocate pursuit of inner beauty, that is platonic love, and more inward and abstract forms of beauty. Plato would be astonished at the folly of modern man, who thirsts for the divine and for power because he has eclipsed the divine, who can fly to outer space and plumb the depths of the ocean, but remains blind to the all-shining presence of beauty in itself in earthly beauties. And modern man who worships power through his tragic descent into the body, thus succumbing to ethically primitive, racially prejudiced aesthetic norms of beauty. Plato would perhaps conclude that although racism has always existed, modern racism, like modern technology, is historically unprecedented. I'm going to now conclude with returning to the Dalai Lama, who often says we are the same human beings, sometimes pointing to minor physical differences. What does he mean? This cannot be a literal sameness of physical features, mental capacities, or spiritual maturity, etc., because we do vary in terms of these. I'm not placing a judgment on it, but just pointing out that human beings do vary in all three aspects. Nor does the sameness come from sameness of identity. I think His Holiness draws sameness from his personal experience of perfected empathy. So perfected empathy means literally being the being of every being by overcoming body consciousness, hence race consciousness. Perfected empathy means that His Holiness literally experiences individuated experiences of other beings. And perfected empathy also means aesthetic indifference drawn from the chaste eye and its characteristic body blindness. As a saint, His Holiness is capable of experiencing perfect empathy or oneness with all beings by fully transcending body consciousness through meditation. He, therefore, in my view at least, is the highest anti-racist. But we ordinary idealists would have to rely on more ordinary forms of inner beauty to overcome racist aesthetics. And this is where I end my presentation. And I hope I've not taken up too much time. Looks like there's plenty of time left over for the questions that you might have. And let me just find a way of turning off the stop share. And let me just add that just one last thing here, that I'm repeating myself here. I really don't think aesthetic indifference is something to undermine in any way, because people really judge by appearances all the more today. And it is hugely, I don't think offensive is the right word, because offensiveness, people are thin-skinned these days, everybody gets offended at everything. I don't mean that. I mean that appearance-based prejudices sometimes translate to more serious forms of injustice, such as identity. The worst of identity politics is based on appearances, after all, and racial kind of cognition of racial categories. So aesthetic prejudices matter beyond mere appearance, is what I'm trying to say. And they are a form of hatred, so they matter. Thank you so much for listening. You're very patient, and you've taken time off from your busy schedules to listen to us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand this over now to Professor Karen Bishop-Morris. And Professor Yamada and I are here to answer any questions or to engage in a dialogue of our own if there's extra time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professors Yamada and Majumdar. What an interesting discussion. And I know that we do have some questions in the chat. I'm encouraging other folks to go ahead and formulate those questions and send them along. But we have Professor Meeta Chowdhury on screen, who will begin with the first question.
Thank you very much, Karen, and for two excellent presentations today. As both of you were speaking, I was thinking of the very, very hard work of European civilizational praxis, beginning, I would say, well, 400, 500 years of really hard work to drive home those, the discussion about proportion, which is, of course, which Professor Majumdar touches upon, and along with the notion of the pure marble-like skin. With all due respect to our colleagues and those listening who might be religious and of a Christian faith, I would say that we are familiar with how Jesus Christ himself has been portrayed. Those Nordic looks, which, and we do not have to conjure up Christ's image, we know that that image is aligned very closely to the Nordic, what we recognize as northern, extreme northern European. In addition, we are aware of how Greeks have been represented, Greek heroes. And this takes us to classical forms as well as classical philosophy. Greek heroes, all of them in white marble. And therefore their stature, it's not just the size, but also the color emphasized over and over again. What we are attempting to do today in the 21st century is to dismantle something that started a very long time ago. So I would appreciate some comments from both speakers, Professor Yamada, Professor Majumdar, about, we've talked about philosophy and practicality, but also history, if you don't mind. Thank you.
So Professor Yamada, you're our guest, why don't you go ahead?
Wow.
Or, I mean, well, if you want to, yeah.
No, actually, I want to actually leave to you, Deepa, first. But you know, okay. I'm not an expert in religion, so okay. Maybe, yeah, I know just, you know, I know little about it. So maybe, you know, you can, yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Meeta, for this excellent question. Let me begin at a point which will be slightly tangential, which is to say that sometimes what I call secondary racism, which is different from how it's, I understand it differently from how it's being treated in the discourse. I understand secondary racism as racism that is passed on by those who suffer, those who are victims of racism onto those lower in the totem pole of racism. And sometimes brown people do that, or within, you know, brown and black people do that to people of, you know, they construct their own totem pole based on lighter skin color and darker shades. Sometimes secondary racism can be much more vicious and violent than primary racism, because Europe has changed. Let's not forget that Europe is no longer the same Europe as it was in the colonial days, thanks to progressive movements, the whole country, and I would say this is a quasi-positive aspect of Eros, I guess, because of intermarriage and things like that. The whole idea of beauty has really changed in the Western Hemisphere. it still has not sometimes in the mind of the colonized. And I'm speaking from direct experience here. As a child growing up in a remote part of India, I suffered secondary racism at a level that I've never seen in the West. You know, it was a given that those who looked like me would never receive justice. You know, so, and this is happening within the same country. So that's my somewhat tangential caveat. And let me just move on then to your specific question, which is, first of all, I came from a perspective of theological perspective of Platonism, not Christianity, but you're completely right. The way Christ has been portrayed has often been very Eurocentric. That's not to say that, you know, that's how, I mean, first of all, it's the person Christ and not the body of Christ that really, even though the body of Christ matters hugely in Christian theology as a sacred body, but it's not the skin color of Christ that really matters. As to how to change this, I think I work at two levels. One is the level of ideals, which is what I presented. The other is the level of realpolitik, which is really hugely realistic, which is that realism being what it is, with the shift in all kinds of globalisms. First of all, the world is more interconnected now than ever before, and that is going to definitely affect our views of beauty. Secondly, Europe is no longer the same Europe. America may be lagging a little behind, but America has an advantage in being more interracial from the get-go in very brutal sadistic terms of how, you know, Native Americans and African Americans were treated. But the point is that the West is no longer the same West. So the world is changing, and with it, the norms of beauty. That's my second larger point. The third is that as China rises in the horizon, and, you know, from everything I can see, it seems to me like China will be the next superpower. We're going to see completely different norms of beauty, maybe as racist, but the totem pole will still be there, but the hierarchies on the totem pole will shift and change in terms of realpolitik. And then finally, the ultimate endeavor, I do believe in the individual. I do believe in free will. And I don't think collective consciousness can change unless the individual changes in the first place from within. So I think it becomes cynical to gloss over individuality. So I think at the highest level, it's only individuals who can work on themselves to say, through the quest for self-knowledge, to say, and here I'm borrowing from Eastern Vedantic thought, to say that, look, I am not my body. Who am I? When you begin with that question, who am I? You first encounter a plethora of identities, of which race is one. The ego is like a mosaic of identities, and the body is another. And race is based on body. And the minute you recognize that, look, I can't just be my body, I must be something more. The minute, for example, you feel bewildered or offended when someone sees you, even politely, only in race terms, that means the steps towards climbing Plato's ladder have begun already. So, for example, the first time a young man, he happened to be white, said to me, and he was trying his best to be as correct as possible, he called me a woman of color. I'd never heard that term before. And I just about fainted in shock. I felt completely erased as an individual, as a person, and he meant well. He was trying to respect me, but I felt like under this label, I'm no longer a person, you know? So I think the minute we start reacting like that, we're stepping away from body consciousness towards something higher. And that the higher we go, the more we tap into our collective humanity, the more we transition from hatred to love, and which is the real meaning of color blindness. Professor Yamada is completely right. Color blindness, when used mischievously, mischievous is too kind a word, when used with racist agendas, becomes very destructive. But color blindness in its essence and heart, the way the Dalai Lama uses it, or body blindness, means that individual endeavor to really recognize myself in the other and the other in myself. That's a scenario of total empathy. And that can only happen from the individual. I know the late Desmond Tutu spoke a lot about this whole idea in South African, might have been, I'm not sure if it was a Zulu ideal or a general South African ideal of Ubuntu, I think is what he called it, of I am because you are, and you are because I am, you know. So this collective empathy, which is happening through crude tools like global trade, and the sexual revolution. I call them both pretty crude tools compared to the Platonic ideals. But through them, I think we are ascending towards greater unanimity. I mean, the fact that the whole world, or almost the whole world, has unanimously condemned Mr. Putin's actions speaks volumes right there for how much we've progressed. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I certainly did my best.
Can I actually jump in? Well, actually, I do appreciate what Deepa was saying. The interesting thing was that you gave two types of racism, primary racism and secondary racism. And yeah, I agree that secondary racism can be kind of a more brutal, in a sense. Well, maybe, people who, does that, they don't recognize, and then so that they don't really consider it, it's gonna be harmful, in a way, right? And also, well, actually, I want to say that in sociology, actually, race is considered. We have a definition of race. Race is a socially constructed. So I think an idea of beauty also can be constructed depending on the places. And so I was actually thinking while I was listening to Deepa, and also the person, actually the Mita, sorry if I pronounce, I don't pronounce your name, but so really depending on the regions and country. And when I was actually students living in Canada before I came to the United States, I met a Mexican person, we shared the same class. And so while we proceed our conversation, well, he showed me, well, he told me he's a Christian, he's a Mexican, he's from Mexico. And he showed me the photo of a mother, Maria, her skin color was black. So I was really actually shocked. I never seen that, Maria, figure with the skin color is black and actually brown. And he showed that photo and to me and saying, I believe in this God and this, Maria. So that's why, I carry this, I carry this picture with me, always. So of course, first of all, I was shocked because, I just shocked my, ignorance first of all. Somehow, I'm not a Christian, I'm a Buddhist. I'm growing up in Japan, so I have a different and a cultural lens to see other people. So I have to admit that. So that's why I need to meet people and talk to and just expand a conversation so that I can learn from each other. And always, I learn and I shock, with myself and how ignorant I am. So really, perception is socially constructed, culturally constructed. It's ongoing. So I guess I don't really not necessarily answer the question, but I'm just making a comment. And also this is related what Deepa was saying. The beauty is constructed, right? In a sense. So.
Thank you both. So there's a lot of interest in the chat, Professor Yamada, about this colorblind ideology. And so the next couple of questions are directed to either of you, but one specifically asks, how does this colorblind ideology shape ideas of beauty? And what are some of the daily implications or implications you've noticed on our daily lives?
How the color blindness
shapes our ideas of beauty, and then what are some of the implications of this on our daily lives?
Is it, I don't know, portrait in media or how we
Would be one way.
speak?
I think those are valid examples.
So like I said, the colorblind attitude is really subtle and becoming norm to us. So mainly, I don't know, nowadays in mass media, influence, largely, greatly, and affect our everyday consciousness. And also nowadays, the role of social media plays a very important part too. So not just in visual, but maybe, you know, textual too.
Mhm.
I don't know, yeah, Deepa.
Yeah. So Karen, the question again is, how does color blindness affect beauty? And what was the last part of the question?
And what are the implications you've observed on our daily lives, on our
Okay,
lives?
okay. Let me begin by saying that, you know, to say something is not to be that, right? Which is where the risk of hypocrisy comes in. And all of academia comes with that. Just like free will comes with the risk of evil, academia comes with the risk of hypocrisy, because we can say something, but we don't have to. Our whole practice is based on what we say and what we write, not on who we are, actually. There's a big difference between words spoken and our actual being. So just because the person says, I am colorblind, means nothing if it's not genuine colorblindness. Genuine colorblindness is a very difficult thing. It means rising above the body completely. Very few people are at that point. So if the Dalai Lama said I'm colorblind, I would believe, but it's hard for me to believe an everyday person saying I'm colorblind just because they're saying it. So my answer to this question would be, just because a person is saying I'm colorblind doesn't mean that they do not retain their own internal norms of beauty, which can be not only racist, but also sadistic. You know, because of the sexual revolution, sometimes beauty has become very, can be, I wouldn't say has become, but has become more varied within color categories, okay? I mean, somebody who is a very sadistic person would see beauty in somebody that they can oppress, okay? Their beauty also comes sometimes hidden inside the racist's mind, which is why arch racists sometimes are erotically attracted to the very people, in a very sadistic way, to the very people that they have otherwise a prejudice towards. In its positive aspect, eros sometimes helps overcome the prejudice because the act of falling in love is somewhat sublimating, by making a racist, you know, fall in love with someone that they would otherwise be racist towards. So I think the whole idea of colorblindness and beauty is much more complex. And colorblindness, first of all, need not mean real emancipation from racist notions of beauty. There are hidden racist notions of beauty. There are also further complexities of beauty coming from the whole idea of eros and sexual revolution, sadomasochistic notions of beauty. And then finally, I mean, the truest test is, if you say you're colorblind, then would you fall in love with somebody of the so-called wrong color? You know, and if not, then that means you still have a preferential view, right? A colorblind person would be beyond the body and would be capable of loving only for inner kind of virtues, or rather would be chaste in their love, in the sense of first falling in love and then finding beauty in that person. That's a very much more chaste way of approaching beauty, through love, through eros, than otherwise. So I'm not sure how to, like I've said before, I'm not sure that I completely agree with Professor Yamada. The way colorblindness is being used today I think is harmful, because it's being used inappropriately and insincerely. It's just a claim. We don't know that it's really true. And I think it's, as far as how it affects, life and how it affects activism and all of that. I know that all these statements, again, it's all about verbiage. It's all about what Platonists would call discursive speech. It's not necessarily sincere. All these, what are they called? What's the form of all these mission statements that institutions have? We do not discriminate on the basis of color, race, etc. They sound very noble, but are they actually practiced? That's the whole question. There are all kinds of hidden strategies around that. You know, I've heard immigrant students say, you know, these employers are all saying this. When it comes time to hiring me, if I say I'm not a US citizen, suddenly things change, you know? So again, I'd make a big distinction between being colorblind genuinely and claiming colorblindness. And I think it affects activism too, in the sense that the whole field of activism, I'm speaking as sort of a former activist, and my mother was an activist too, so I'm speaking from multiple traditions here and multiple generations. I think the whole field of activism is very, very, it's again, to be realistic, it's not all pretty solidarity. There's lots of snakes there that one has to watch out for. Besides ideological differences, there is also an erotic component to activism. And that's where beauty comes in again. And again, it's a path like any other path. I respect it. And I think I've learned hugely from it, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily the only path or even the exclusive way of transforming society. The great activists of our times, like Nelson Mandela, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Gandhi, and MLK, I think worked on themselves first and primarily, which is why MLK uses self-purification as a prior, it's one of his 4 steps, and he uses that prior to direct action, because you must first purify yourself before you're capable of direct action. And part of the self-purification is to move from rhetoric to actual being, from merely claiming colorblindness to actually being colorblind. So I don't know if I quite answered the question, but again, I did my best.
No, I think that's great. I think we were just looking for some discussion there. So I just want to remind folks, we have about 5 minutes remaining for questions. We want to leave time. I have a few more questions here, but if you have a question that's pressing, please post it in the chat now. I have a few more questions sort of in the pipeline, and then we want to leave time for a final comment from each speaker, and then we will preview our final 2 events in the series this semester. So the next question actually deals with microaggressions. How can microaggressions impact students' academic experiences?
Ooh. Actually, it's huge. So I do care about that. Well, as I said, microaggression can be really tricky because it is often unintentional, unaware. So yeah, well, I think if I can give a specific question, maybe example, especially I'm from Japan. I am Japanese, so I can really speak about actually sort of I try not to overgeneralize, but maybe stereotype. How stereotype can influence people's behavior negatively or positively, that kind of thing. Well, you may think about stereotypes associated with particular race and ethnicity, right? When it comes to Asian people, there is a stereotype. Asian people are quiet, and then people may think that, well, it's not necessarily harmful, but it is. It can be harmful because Asian are expected to be quiet, to some extent. Right, so I know, well, it's not my class, but some students actually, they're Asian students in a classroom. Of course, if well, they're actually told, I assigned not me, but they are assigned to a particular group, do group discussion or activity, and then within the group member, how they treat Asian students, you're so quiet. So that comment can be also microaggression, because Asians are somehow based on the stereotype, they are expected to be quiet, but always, of course, and that happen. So when they actually fight against that, of course, they can break that norm or expect the stereotype, but at the same time, in many cases, they are kind of accepting the stereotype and then just let it go. So, what happened, making them kind of invisible. So I think invisibility is a really huge consequences. And actually recently I experienced that, people make me kind of invisible within the conversation, to just keep me, I don't know, pretend not to see me or something, avoiding expressions, exchanging with me. So it's really subtle, I wasn't really, confident enough to speak up. But, later I spoke to, my colleague and said, that this person also said, I felt the same way. Okay, I thought, why didn't you say it in the meeting, right? But so it's really subtle. And sometimes, we it's easy to let it go. But now even, took me for a while to recognize and, reach out, just for myself, decided, well, maybe, if I feel uncomfortable, I just say it, because that also affects my behavior. I think making people or comments invisible is really harmful in a sense, and feeling oppressed, really. So I think if that happened to students, it is tremendously a huge impact, that'll cause negative grades and academic performance. You can see that it's not direct, but I think more deeply harmful. I don't know, I try to explain, but
that's really great. I want to make sure we have time for this last question, and then I'll ask for a very brief sort of final comment from each of you. So this person acknowledges that microaggressions are experiential and subjective, and therein lies part of the problem. How does one keep from being a perpetrator of microaggressions?
Deepa, you want to say?
Sure. I mean, self-reflection is always important. Introspection is always important. Knowing, I think, to be really fair, or not fair, but really to be really just, a just person, one has to be just to oneself as well, which requires knowing one's own deepest intentions. If, some people are hugely politically wrong, instead of being politically correct, but their hearts are in the right place. I prefer that any day to somebody who's politically correct with sinister motives, So for example, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, I don't think is particularly politically correct, So I think knowing in one's own heart whether one meant ill or meant well helps, so that if you, end up expressing yourself in a way that is read by the other person as microaggressive, you can defend yourself and say, well, that's not what I meant. But ordinary introspection helps too, because you can then purify yourself, like Dr. King said, and learn to erase those. Only you, the individual, can do it for yourself. I don't think anybody else can, not even therapy can do it. Because only you can really change yourself. So here I'm borrowing from Aristotle. It's habits, virtues come from habits. You practice something and then it becomes part of who you are. So that would be my 2 cents worth.
Thank you. So a final word from each of you, Professor Yamada? We'll begin with you.
Yeah, well, really, I want to say thank you so much for a really, rich conversation. It's been really productive, and still I am learning, and just giving me opportunity is such a grateful. So it really, I'm hoping we will keep this conversation in a various way, and then keep keeping a dialogue. It's really important. Thank you.
Thank you all so much again for taking time off from your busy schedules to attend our series, and hope you'll attend the last two. And I can only express my hope that we all collectively transition from fake colorblindness to genuine kind of colorblindness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've been listening to Professor Meiko Yamada, Professor of Sociology from Purdue University, Fort Wayne, and Professor Deepa Majumdar, Professor of Philosophy here at Purdue University Northwest. Thank you both. And with that, we're going to preview our final 2 installments in the series. On Tuesday, March 22nd, 12:30 to 1:45, same Zoom, we'll have Dr. Niti Parashar, Professor of Physics here at Purdue University Northwest and institution leader at Fermilab and CERN. From barriers and biases to belonging, lessons from a female physicist. I think this is the first time we'll actually have some insight into racism and anti-racism in a STEM context. And so that should be super, super exciting and interesting and insightful. And then our last talk in the series is actually Professor of Sociology Kim Sipes and his guest, Vince Emanuel from Purdue University Northwest, an alumni. And the title of their talk is Anti-Racism and the Face of War. And so they'll be addressing race in the military, which is timely given the world's affairs. So that's it. That does it for this installment of our series. Thank you all for making the time to join us today. Have a safe rest of the day, first day of spring.